He says it was from the gun. He says A$AP Rocky was the one who had a gun. He says that it was A$AP Rocky who pulled the trigger and fired at him. That's a lot to have riding on one witness who happens to be a witness with a motive, who happens to be a witness that may have been biased in this case. The trial of Monica Sementilli kicks off with prosecutors detailing how a torrid love affair led to the brutal murder of a famed Los Angeles hairstylist, orchestrated by his own wife. Plus, the man who claims a platinum-selling hip-hop artist shot him in the hand takes the stand as the prosecution of A$AP Rocky reaches its most pivotal day of testimony. And a Hollywood wannabe accused of dumping 2 women near the point of death at separate hospitals testifies on his own behalf in his double homicide trial. All this and more this week on Courtroom Confidential. The downtown courthouse in Los Angeles was extremely busy this week, with 2 of our featured cases taking place just down the hall from each other. Lots for us to discuss. We are recording this episode on Thursday, January 30th, 2025. Let's jump right in. A California woman accused in the murder of her famed hairstylist husband is standing trial in a Los Angeles courtroom this week. Monica Sementilli is charged with murder and conspiracy in the death of Fabio Sementilli. Prosecutors say Monica and her lover, Robert Baker, killed Fabio to continue their affair and cash in on a life insurance policy worth $1.6 million. Fabio was found stabbed to death at their Woodland Hills home on January 23rd of 2017. It was initially believed to be a home invasion robbery gone awry, but Monica and Baker were arrested 6 months later after investigators uncovered their affair. DNA evidence at the scene also connected Baker to the murder. Last July, Baker pleaded no contest to the charges against him. He accepted a sentence of life in prison without parole. Months later, Baker told 48 Hours that Monica had nothing to do with Fabio's death. In October, a 3rd person was arrested in the murder plot. Christopher Austin was extradited from Washington State on charges of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Ahead of jury selection in Monica's trial, prosecutors announced, quote, Austin pled guilty to 2nd-degree murder and the personal use of a knife in exchange for his truthful testimony against the defendant. Austin faces 16 years to life in prison at his sentencing scheduled for April 30th. Deputy District Attorney Beth Silverman said in her opening statement that Monica was the only person who knew the narrow time frame her husband would be home alone. Quote, lust, greed, betrayal. That's what this case is about, Silverman told the court, adding that the murder was the senseless slaughter of a thoroughly innocent and decent human being. Monica, through her attorneys, maintains her claim that she had no part in Fabio's death. What's happening here? We have 2 key witnesses in this case, one for the prosecution and one for the defense, and both of them are convicted killers. One is going to be serving life without parole, without any promises or guarantees made by the prosecution. That man will testify. He will testify for the defense that Monica Sementilli had nothing to do with this murder. That is what we expect to hear when the defense begins to put on their case. The other key witness is serving as little as 16 years for the same crime, based upon an agreement that he made to cooperate with the prosecution. One person who was involved in an affair with the defendant and the other who had nothing to gain from this murder. So really, this entire case is going to come down to a choice for the jury on who are they going to believe between these 2 men. One person who received a good deal. I realize 16 years may not sound like a good deal, but when you're looking at life in prison without parole, which is what the other gentleman will be sentenced to or has been sentenced to, 16 years is starting to look pretty good. 16 years is starting to look like something where you might want to cooperate with the prosecution and where I'm sure the defense is going to highlight to the jurors, you might want to shade your testimony a certain way. And then another person who's going to prison for the rest of their life, appearing to have really nothing to gain by testifying. If he in fact testifies as we expect, he will testify that it was all his idea, that Monica had nothing to do with it. Who is the jury going to believe? Who are they going to find to be more credible? But there is more to this case than just the testimony of these two men. Like any murder case involving a loved one, involving family members, especially a case involving one spouse killing another, motive is going to play a pivotal role in this case. Juries, especially in any case, they want to know the why, but especially in a case where one spouse kills another, they want to know why. And the prosecution better give them a very good reason for it. In this case, it sounds like the prosecution has provided some reason. Money. In fact, $1.6 million worth of money in life insurance. There's also the ongoing affair. She apparently was having a very active affair with Mr. Baker that didn't just involve sexual encounters with the two of them, if you follow what I'm saying. And then there's this idea that she came from a religious background, a Catholic background, where the idea of divorce simply was not an option. Will that be enough for jurors is really going to be the question here. Because if you are left with these two witnesses, and if the jurors are split between who to believe, between those two pivotal witnesses, they're going to need some sort of reason to understand why this woman was involved in this. Now, there is other evidence, obviously. There's encrypted text messages, and there is apparently videotape where she is alleged to be checking her phone in the surveillance cameras of the house at the time of the murders. I'm not trying to oversimplify this case. I'm sure that the prosecution will do a very admirable job in presenting the evidence in this case beyond what I have the time to explain to you here and now. But really, it's going to come down to those two witnesses, those two pivotal people, those two people who were in the room when this man was killed, who took part in taking this man's life. Who between the two of them are they going to believe? And I think it's actually a difficult choice. So I think, yes, a lot does ride on motive. A lot does ride on other evidence, but a lot is going to ride on motive in this case. But what do you guys think? Who do you think the jury will believe between these two men testifying? Who do you think they will find to be more credible? Please let us know in the comments. Terrell Efron, also known by his moniker ASAP Relly, took the witness stand this week in the assault trial of rapper ASAP Rocky and accused his former friend of firing a gun at him during a confrontation between the two in Hollywood in 2021. Prosecutors questioned Efron about the sequence of events during a heated argument when the defendant, whose legal name is Rakeem Mayers, allegedly brandished a gun. Asked why he would follow someone he knew had a gun, Efron said that since it was a busy street in Hollywood, he believed Mayers wouldn't shoot him. Mayers and Efron were childhood friends and both part of the Harlem-based rap collective ASAP Mob. Quote, Rocky turned around and then it was like, boom. Efron said, recounting the alleged shooting. The whole thing was like a movie. He kind of like pointed down and he shot the first shot. Efron said that his hand was grazed by a bullet and felt hot. He said that he then grabbed one of their friends and stood behind him for cover when Mayers allegedly fired again before leaving the scene. Prosecutors concluded their questioning of Efron on Wednesday, but he is expected to be on the stand on Thursday to face cross-examination as we are recording this episode. During opening arguments last week, Mayer's lead attorney Joe Tacopina told the jury they will hear from multiple witnesses during the trial who will testify that the gun seen in the surveillance video is absolutely nothing more than a prop gun that is often used in movies and music videos. Mayers, a Grammy-nominated hip-hop star and partner to pop star Rihanna, was charged with 2 counts of assault with a semi-automatic firearm. If convicted, he could face up to 24 years in prison. What is happening here? First off, let me just start by sharing my feelings on this case. I do not think this is a strong case for the prosecution, and we'll get into the reasons why. But surprisingly, it may have been strengthened by the admission made by the defense during their own opening statements. And this is what I mean. The prosecution has the burden of proving every element of the crime, including if the defendant was actually the person who pulled the trigger, including if the defendant was actually even in possession of a gun at the time of the shooting, including proving that it was actually a real gun used in the shooting. Remember, keep in mind, no gun was ever recovered in this case. Responding officers, when they first rolled out, they didn't find any evidence of a shooting. Yes, a bystander heard shots, but no one, including what we see on that video, has been a witness to this shooting that we have heard from so far. No one, including that grainy video, I think can place the gun in Rocky's hands at the time of the shooting and say he is the one that actually pulled the trigger. Anyone could have. Any one of those people. There's a group of people standing there. Anyone could have been armed with a gun. Why not, if you're the defense, leave it at that? Isn't that reasonable doubt? The prosecution cannot tell you who pulled the trigger. At best, the prosecution can tell you that ASAP Rocky appeared to have a gun in his hand earlier, but not at the pivotal moment when the shots went off. Why not leave it at that? Why admit that your client was the one who pulled the trigger? Now, I realize they've said it's a prop gun. It couldn't fire actual bullets. Maybe they felt that they had to explain why was there a gun in his hand at any point during that day and explain what kind of a gun it was. I get all of that. But why give any ground to the prosecution whatsoever in this case, which is not the strongest case to begin with? Rocky had, in fact, been seen with a gun earlier. But at that time, he didn't aim it at anyone. At that time, he did not pull the trigger. At that time, he merely brandished it. I mean, there's an argument to be made that he either got rid of the gun or he never intended to use that gun, real or not, and that someone else shot, someone that the prosecution has not proven to you beyond a reasonable doubt. It was just a strange strategic choice in my view. But the prosecution's case is not rock solid. Like I said to begin with, I feel that there are major problems with this case. First of all, there's the injury on Relly's hand. This is not a bullet hole. If this was a bullet hole in his ribs, we'd be having an entirely different conversation here. It is a scrape at best across his knuckles. Could he receive that in a fist fight? Could he have even received that in the fight that we witnessed earlier in a different camera angle that was much more clear as to what was taking place? Now, he says it was from the gun. He says ASAP Rocky was the one who had a gun. He says that it was ASAP Rocky who pulled the trigger and fired at him. That's a lot to have riding on one witness who happens to be a witness with a motive, who happens to be a witness that may have been biased in this case. As a prosecutor, you never want to rely on one witness alone. You don't want to hitch the entire success of your case to one witness alone, especially when that witness happens to have a dog in the fight. If we're talking about some impartial person who doesn't know these two men from each other at all, and that's what you're putting all of your hopes and dreams for a guilty verdict on that witness, that's one thing. But your best witness, your only witness who's going to put that gun in the hands of ASAP Rocky happens to be the alleged victim and happens to be somebody who has beef with him and happens to be somebody who has a vested interest in the outcome of this case. Not a good spot to find yourself in as the prosecution. But what do you guys think? Did the defense make a critical error by even admitting that Rocky fired a shot from a prop gun or not? Or do you think that's not a problem given the problems of this case to begin with? Let us know in the comments. Against the advice of his attorney, self-described entertainment professional David Pearce took the stand in his own defense this week. He and his roommate, Brand Osborne, are charged in the 2021 drugging deaths of Christy Giles and Hilda Marcella Cabrales Arzola. Prosecutors have accused Pearce of providing fatal doses of narcotics to both women, then failing to get them proper medical attention. On the night prosecutors allege Pearce served Giles and Arzola a deadly batch of cocaine, Pearce said he met the young women in a drug room at a warehouse rave. He painted himself as a concerned party who did his best to aid two women he barely knew. Quote, "The lifestyle that I was living at the time was not very conducive to regular behavior, if that makes sense," Pearce testified on Tuesday. "It was not uncommon for people to use my house as a crash pad, a party house. I know it's horrible, but at least on a weekly basis, friends were passing out at my house." Pearce said he helped the unconscious women to bed, placing them on their sides with water and a trash can in case they needed to vomit, then went to sleep. Nearly 12 hours went by. Neither woman woke up. Pearce said he grew concerned and repeatedly checked on them, eventually taking Giles to an area hospital. When he got back to his apartment, Arzola was still unconscious. Pearce said he started administering CPR, but at no point did he call 911. Since Pearce's arrest, 7 additional women have come forward to accuse Pearce of raping them. In testimony that spanned 2 days, Pearce denied each rape accusation, saying he never met at least one of his accusers and dismissing the rest of the encounters as consensual. Pearce described a booze and drug-fueled lifestyle and said most of the women came onto him at parties or through dating apps. Los Angeles County Deputy District Attorney Seth Carmack repeatedly hammered Pearce for failing to call 911, even as the women had been unconscious for more than 12 hours at his apartment. Pearce said he wasn't sure how sick they were and previously had problems with delays when calling 911 for sick people at his house. Closing arguments in the 2-week trial began on Wednesday of this week. What is happening here? As sick and demented as this man's testimony was, the question we have to ask ourselves is, does it actually provide an explanation for his conduct that evening? And is that explanation not criminal? In other words, does he provide some narrative that the jurors might be able to understand, may not appreciate, but can understand and perhaps find to be believable, that is not criminal? People do have outlandish lifestyles, things that we may not understand or even agree with, but that does not necessarily make them criminal. People do take recreational drugs. Overdoses do happen. Tragedies do happen. The question that the defense poses to these jurors is, could it be that these poor girls just got a bad batch of drugs on their own and had an adverse reaction? And that Pearce is only guilty of not realizing the desperate state that they were in and not taking them to the hospital immediately. Maybe the jury could struggle with that. But then you introduce the evidence that this is not an anomaly in Pearce's life. 7 women have bravely come forward with remarkably similar stories, women who are unconnected to each other, women who have not colluded with each other to come up with this narrative. This is no longer a case about a tragic event taking place on one night. It's about ongoing predatory behavior that was on a collision course for disaster and death. This is no longer an accidental overdose. This is now murder. And he does not have an answer for those 7 women. 7 women who were survivors of sexual assault at the hands of David Pearce. But more than that, 7 women who may have very likely escaped their own deaths at the hand of this monster. But what do you guys think? Do you think this is a case of murder or just a tragic overdose, as the defense would have you believe? Please let us know in the comments. Before we dive into the other cases making headlines this week, I'm going to ask one very small favor from you, and that is, if you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel now. We want to continue to provide you with the highest quality content that we possibly can, and the best way we can do that is through your support. And don't forget to check out Courtroom Confidential, the podcast. Please join our community on all major podcast platforms. Also making headlines, Kouri Richins appeared in court last Thursday for an evidentiary hearing as her April trial for murder, attempted murder, and financial crimes draws closer. Richins, who stands accused of using fentanyl to poison and kill her husband, Eric, has been awaiting trial since her arrest in May of 2023. Judge Richard Mrazek considered 3 motions to suppress statements, electronic data, as well as the controversial walk the dog letter collected as evidence during the investigation. Richins' defense is now arguing that investigators in the case took evidence without a proper warrant and without reading her rights. Attorneys cross-examined Summit County Sheriff's Office Detective Eric Maynard and Deputy Jamie Woody, both of whom carried out the search warrants related to the case. When questioned on if Richins was ever admonished of her right to have a lawyer present or to remain silent, both investigators admitted that no Miranda advisement was given. The defense then turned to a notebook seized during a home search on May 8th, highlighting that a proper warrant did not exist to allow for the seizure of the notebook, further contending that it contained information that was protected under the mental health therapist-patient privilege. Finally, the defense argued that the infamous walk the dog letter, which was found in Richins' jail cell and allegedly details instructions to her family on how to testify, was actually privileged attorney-client and work product information. According to the defense, the letter was found in a manila envelope marked, quote, Sky Lazaro, and in parentheses, attorney privilege, whereas jail staff said the letter was found in an LSAT prep book. The next hearing is February 3rd, when attorneys will present a draft jury selection questionnaire to Mrazek. For more in-depth coverage on this case, please check out our case notes episode linked in the description. A West Virginia jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding a former pharmacist, Natalie Cochran, guilty of first-degree murder on Wednesday in the 2019 death of her husband, Michael Cochran. Prosecutors alleged that Cochran poisoned her husband with insulin in fear of him revealing a Ponzi scheme for which she was later convicted of in federal court. According to prosecutors, on the day Michael Cochran died, Natalie told friends he wasn't feeling well. When friends urged her to take him to the hospital, Cochran said she would let him, quote, sleep it off. He died 5 days later. On Thursday, the court will meet to decide whether or not Natalie will be eligible for parole after a period of 15 years, or if she will spend the rest of her life in prison without the chance of parole. On Wednesday, accused murderer and Florida socialite Donna Adelson gave impromptu testimony about 2 fellow inmates who claimed to have spoken with a conspirator in the Dan Markel murder-for-hire plot and received information that could prove helpful to Adelson's defense. Judge Stephen Everett scheduled the hearing to discuss a motion by Adelson's lawyers seeking to compel the 2 inmates to sit for depositions because they may not be available to testify at trial. The inmates both claim to have previous jailhouse conversations with Catherine McBanois, who was convicted in 2022 in the Markel plot and sentenced to life in prison. They shared the statements with Adelson and a new private investigator for the defense. Quote, our concern is that they will not be available because they will go back to using drugs and will either potentially not be able to be located or may not be competent to testify depending on the condition they are in at the time, said Josh Zellman, one of Adelson's lawyers. According to Adelson, one of the unnamed inmates told her that McBanois said, quote, I'm going to take care of that family. Wait until they see what they're going to get, and I'm going to get a reduced sentence. Adelson testified that the other inmate told her that McBanois made it very clear that she was blackmailing Charlie, my son. In the end, Judge Everett denied the motion for deposed testimony, saying, quote, if this were a situation where we were dealing with something such as a military deployment or someone who is dealing with a grave illness or something that is more concrete than just this person may use drugs again in the future, I think we'd be on a little more firmer footing. Trial is currently set for early June. A New York judge set a March 2026 trial date on Monday as the public feud between Blake Lively and her It Ends With Us co-star and director Justin Baldoni continued to accelerate. Judge Louis Lyman also moved an initial conference from mid-February to next week and told lawyers to be prepared to address complaints about pretrial publicity and attorney conduct. Judge Lyman took the actions after Lively's lawyers claimed in a filing that an attorney for Baldoni was trying to taint potential jurors. Lively's lawyers contend that attorney Bryan Friedman, representing Baldoni, was, quote, engaging in this extrajudicial campaign to influence these proceedings and the public perception of legal filings to this court, and there already is a serious risk that misconduct is tainting the jury pool. Lively sued Baldoni, his production company, and others in New York in late December for sexual harassment and attacks on her reputation and asked for unspecified damages. Baldoni then brought his own lawsuit earlier this month, accusing Lively and her husband Ryan Reynolds of defamation and extortion and seeking at least $400 million in damages. The judge also disclosed on Monday that he likely combined the lawsuits for trial. The Idaho judge overseeing the case against multiple murder suspect Bryan Kohberger has announced that he will release a redacted transcript from a closed-door hearing held last week, which he had initially barred the public and the media from attending. Ada County Judge Stephen Hippler told court officials to hand over verbatim copies of the unredacted transcript from the sealed hearing on January 23rd to both the prosecution and the defense so they could recommend redactions. The hearing centered around forensic investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG, evidence that Kohberger's lawyers want thrown out. During a two-day public proceeding that followed the closed hearing last week, the defense argued the FBI violated Kohberger's Fourth Amendment rights by using the controversial investigative process. Judge Hippler, while reserving his judgment for a later date, appeared unreceptive to the arguments that IgG techniques violated Kohberger's constitutional rights and questioned whether the defendant even had standing to challenge the investigatory tactic. The prosecution countered that there's no expectation of privacy in connection with public records and crime scene evidence. A ruling is expected by the judge in the coming days. Marilyn Manson will not face criminal charges in a series of sexual assault and domestic violence allegations, Los Angeles County prosecutors announced Friday. The musician, whose real name is Bryan Warner, has been under investigation by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department since 2021 after several women came forward to accuse him of rape and abuse. His accusers included Westworld actress Evan Rachel Wood and Game of Thrones actress Esme Bianco. Allegations first surfaced in 2021 after Bianco sued Manson, alleging sexual assault, sexual battery, and human trafficking. The two settled Bianco's lawsuit in 2023. LA County Sheriff's Department investigators raided Manson's mansion in 2021 and presented a case to the district attorney's office in 2022. The allegations led Manson to cancel tours, and he was dropped by his record label, a rare retreat from an artist who has courted chaos and controversy his entire career. But years went by without a filing. Manson returned to tour, and his accusers grew frustrated. District Attorney Nathan Hochman said in a statement Friday that the statute of limitations had run out on the domestic violence allegations and that prosecutors did not believe they could prove the sexual assault charges beyond a reasonable doubt. Before we jump into what's on the docket for next week, I wanted to take a moment to thank you all for your support. The love from our continuing to grow community has been absolutely amazing. But I wanted to give a special shout out to Teresa Sounds for their fantastic review on Apple Podcasts, as well as to our CC crew members, Woman of Steel and Dorgan881 for their thoughtful comments on YouTube. Please keep them coming, folks. We absolutely love hearing from you. And tell us where you are from. We are thrilled by the growth of our international community. On the docket for next week, Shanna Gardner, who was accused in the murder-for-hire plot to kill her ex-husband, Microsoft executive Jared Bredigan, will be back in court February 3rd for a pretrial hearing. Highland Park parade mass shooting suspect Robert Crimo will return to court on February 6th for a status hearing ahead of his upcoming trial. He is charged with killing 7 people at an Independence Day parade in suburban Chicago in 2022. OnlyFans model Courtney Clenny, charged with fatally stabbing her boyfriend in 2022, will be back in court on February 7th for further pretrial discussions. Nima Momeni, who is found guilty of second-degree murder in the fatal stabbing of Cash App founder Bob Lee, will be sentenced on February 7th. He faces 15 years to life in prison for the murder with the possibility of enhancements. And finally, on Monday, please join us for a premiere in the latest episode in our Courtroom Confidential conversation series, where we sat down with Scott Reich of Crime Talk. That is it for us this week, folks. I am your host, Josh Ritter. You can find me on all social media at Joshua Ritter ESQ or at joshuaritter.com. And thank you again for joining me. Have a great weekend, and I will see you again next week for another episode of Courtroom Confidential.